Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're joining us. Today, we're diving straight into a massive, desperate 13-year gamble. We're talking about the miraculous birth of a nation against, quite frankly, entirely impossible odds. We're going to break down the facts, the raw numbers, and the absolutely critical decisions that literally turned a seemingly invincible empire completely upside down. So let's get focused and jump right into it. To really get this, we've got to look at two wildly different realities. Picture it, 1763. The British Empire just crushed it in the 7 Years' War, right? They beat their French and Spanish rivals, claiming millions of square miles. They are the global superpower. The sun literally never sets on them. But then, way across the Atlantic, you've got these 13 disparate colonies. They're totally divided by religion, economy, culture, yet somehow, almost by accident, this mighty British Empire is about to alienate every single one of them and unite them in all-out rebellion. For over a century and a half, the vibe was basically salutary neglect. The colonies pretty much ran their own show. But remember that massive global war Britain just won? Yeah, it completely ballooned their national debt. Just paying the interest was eating up half of Britain's annual budget. So they had to look to the colonies for some cash. And honestly, if you're sitting in London, it made perfect sense. A Briton in London was paying around 26 shillings a year in taxes, while a New Englander, they were paying just 1. Okay, let's dive into this. The dominoes of British taxation start falling fast in 1764 with the Sugar Act, quickly followed by the Stamp Act in 65, hitting commercial and legal documents. Now the British thought, hey, minor adjustment, right? Wrong. The colonial reaction was absolute uproar, and it kicks off this vicious cycle. Britain slaps on a tax, like the Townshend Acts, the colonists violently protest and boycott. Britain repeals it but stubbornly doubles down on their authority, until finally we hit the breaking point with the Tea Act of 1773.
That Tea Act, it triggered an absolute explosion of colonial defiance. When the East India Company tried to land there cheaper but still taxed, tea in Boston, the Sons of Liberty said, no way. Disguised as Native Americans, they dumped 340 chests of it straight into the harbor. We're talking about destroyed property valued at a staggering £92,000. To put that in perspective, that's nearly $2 million today. It was an outrageous, massive hit to private property that totally convinced London the time for playing nice was officially over.
But let's dig into the why. At the core of all this fury was a really profound ideological conflict over constitutional rights. Both sides just fundamentally viewed their basic freedoms differently. Americans demanded direct representation, the bedrock idea that you absolutely cannot be taxed without your local explicit consent, period. But the British government, they argued for virtual representation, basically saying, hey, the interests of all subjects are represented generally by MPs in London, even if you didn't vote for them. It was a complete, irreconcilable clash in worldviews. And we really need to remember, this ideological rupture didn't just spark a rebellion. It ignited an incredibly bitter, violent civil war. You had patriots pushing for self-governance on one side, and on the other, loyalists, making up roughly 1 in 5 colonists. These folks doggedly stuck by the king, whether from deep social ties or just a genuine fear of mob rule. It was brutal. Neighbors literally turned on neighbors, patriot mobs drove loyalists right out of their homes, and tax officials were actually tarred and feathered in the streets. So Britain's clapback for the Boston Tea Party was incredibly harsh. They slammed down the coercive acts, which the colonists immediately branded the intolerable acts. General Gage comes in as a military governor, and the Royal Navy totally blockades Boston's port, basically trying to starve the city into submission. But here's the thing, it completely backfired. Instead of isolating Massachusetts and making them an example, it actually united the colonies in solidarity. It drove them to form the first Continental Congress down in Philadelphia to organize a continent-wide boycott. By March 1775, the point of no return was staring them right in the face. Patrick Henry's chilling words echoed this entirely new reality. We were rapidly moving past angry pamphlets and polite petitions, right to the brink of open bloodshed. Colonial militias are out there quietly stockpiling gunpowder, and those British commanders trapped in Boston, they are getting incredibly nervous about all these armed citizen soldiers surrounding them on all sides. When General Gage finally sent troops to Concord to seize those munitions, it sparked actual real warfare at Lexington. And the casualties? Absolutely shocking. The British lost nearly 250 men at Lexington and Concord. Then, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, they launched this massive frontal assault. Sure, the British eventually take the heights, but it cost them 200 dead and over 800 wounded. This ragtag, undisciplined American militia inflicted staggering, totally unsustainable casualties. They proved, without a doubt, they could really stand their ground. Even with the mounting bloodshed, a lot of colonists were still holding out hope for patching things up with the king. But then drops the ultimate catalyst. A British radical named Thomas Paine publishes a pamphlet called Common Sense. Written in plain, everyday English, it just completely mocked the very idea of monarchy. It spread like wildfire, selling an estimated 100,000 copies. Almost single-handedly, it convinced thousands of ordinary folks that a clean break and building an independent republic was literally the only way forward.
This incredible momentum culminates in Philadelphia with the Second Continental Congress. On July 4th, 1776, they make the break official with this soaring, optimistic rhetoric. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. 56 delegates sign it, risking everything: their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. Grand demonstrations erupt everywhere, and they even rip down lead statues of King George to melt them straight into musket balls.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the terrifying dramatic irony of it all. Right as the ink is drying on that Declaration of Independence, the horizon off the coast of New York just fills with sails. General William Howe arrives with the largest armada and expeditionary force in British history. We're talking 32,000 soldiers, 12,000 sailors, and 400 ships. That is nearly half the military might of the entire British Empire, converging directly on New York to crush this rebellion once and for all. What followed was just pure, terrifying, emotional whiplash. George Washington's army of 20,000 men, mostly untrained, severely ill-equipped, faces the British at Long Island. And Washington is decisively outflanked. In the utter chaos, 5,000 fearsome Hessian mercenaries charge the American center. It was an absolute catastrophe. Washington loses over 2,000 men and barely, I mean barely, escapes complete annihilation by silently evacuating his army across the East River under a lucky morning fog. Ultimately, New York City goes up in flames. By the bitter winter of 1776, the Continental Army was literally staring death in the face. As Washington retreats across New Jersey, he's hit with compounding, desperate crises. Thousands of troops are deserting or falling sick with typhus and dysentery. His fighting force plummets to under 6,000 men. And the absolute kicker? Most of those remaining guys' enlistments are legally set to expire at the very end of December. The Continental Congress actually flees Philadelphia in sheer panic. This thick cloud of gloom just covers the land. Thousands of colonists in New York and New Jersey, totally convinced the cause is hopelessly lost, take British pardons and swear oaths of allegiance back to the king. It leaves the patriots facing a really sobering reality. Was the great American experiment truly over before it even began? Would it just freeze to death in the winter mud? But Washington refused to let it end there. With the literal fate of America hanging in the balance, he risks everything on this insanely complex Christmas attack. The audacious plan? 3 columns cross the freezing, ice-clogged Delaware River in the dead of night. 2 columns are supposed to launch diversionary attacks, while Washington's main force of 2,400 men marches through the pitch black to completely surround the Hessian garrison at Trenton right before dawn. Of course, the reality of war never quite matches the plan, right? The execution was total chaos. The river is nearly 300 yards wide, and they're trying to ferry terrified horses and massive cannons in these flat-bottomed boats amid hail and snow. The weather is so severe that 2 of the columns completely abort their missions. Washington is 3 hours behind schedule. But shouldering the entire weight of the revolution, he makes the call to push on alone, leading his exhausted men through a blinding blizzard. And you know what? That gamble paid off spectacularly. Because the weather was so atrocious, the Hessian guards at Trenton had their guard completely down. Washington's men just charge into the town, bayonets fixed, while Henry Knox positions his cannons to fire straight down the streets. In less than an hour, the whole thing was over. The Americans capture an astonishing 900 Hessian soldiers. And the cost to the Americans? A truly miraculous victory with just 5 wounded men. No way, right? But Washington wasn't done. He actually uses his own money and some incredibly stirring words to convince his men to stay just 1 month longer. Days later, he outmaneuvers the British again to attack at Princeton. When his line started to waver, Washington rides straight into the fray, rallying his troops under heavy, heavy fire. As one officer who was there recalled, seeing him brave all those dangers quite literally breathed life right back into the dying revolution. Now, those desperate victories at Trenton and Princeton, they weren't massive in terms of numbers, but they were the absolute vital rays of hope the patriots needed. It even caught the eye of foreign powers like France and Spain. We so often look back at the birth of this nation as just inevitable history. But the truth, it was a deeply fragile, violent, and highly improbable gamble. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. How much are ordinary people truly willing to suffer and risk for the ultimate cost of self-determination? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep questioning the history around you.